Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yurachek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Colin Kealey, and he's the president and CEO of NeuroSIgma, which is a neurostimulator, a wearable that you put on the trigeminal nerve of your children to help prevent ADHD symptoms. Dr. Kealey, pleasure to have you on the show. Do you want to introduce yourself and NeuroSIgma better than I just did?
Yes, thank you, Laden, for having me here. It's very kind of you. So as you said, my name is Dr. Colin Kealey. I'm the president and CEO of NeuroSIgma. And NeuroSIgma is commercializing the Monarch external trigeminal nerve stimulation system, or eTNS system, for treating pediatric ADHD. And actually, in 2019, the company became the first ever to receive an FDA clearance for a non-pharmaceutical ADHD treatment. So that is what the company is currently focused on, though I should say we have investigated a number of other applications in the past, and happy to talk about our pipeline with you today as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting technology. Basically, you put a electric patch on your child and then you shock them into submission or what's the mechanism behind that? It's a strange mechanism that you wouldn't expect. How does it work?
Yeah, we try not to shock anyone into submission, except perhaps with the efficacy of our therapy, shock them that way. But no, this technology has got a bit of a history, actually. So you're probably familiar with vagus nerve stimulation, primarily used for drug-resistant epilepsy, also depression, been investigated for a number of things. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were running the pivotal trial of that technology in the drug-resistant epilepsy population. And one of the highest enrollers in that original trial was a neurologist, Dr. Krista Giorgio at UCLA, and he was fascinated by the VNS technology, and he saw that it was quite effective for some people. But he also had another conclusion, was that, okay, VNS does work for a lot of my epilepsy patients. However, we can debate the sort of response rate of VNS, but let's call it 40% of people respond. And that still leaves that 60% where you're doing these pretty invasive, expensive surgeries, and you're not getting a lot out of it at the end of the day. So he said, I'd like to try to bring this neurostimulation stuff to a wider population and with less cost and less risk. Okay, the cranial nerves, this vagus nerve is cranial nerve 9. What are some other cranial nerves? And he started thinking about it, and you have this thing called the trigeminal nerve, or the fifth cranial nerve, which supplies sensation to the face. Primarily, it does some other stuff too, via these 3 branches that sit right beneath the surface of the skin. You got V1 at the forehead, V2 at the maxillary region, and then V3 is your mandibular branch. And so basically, he started making some prototypes and testing these at UCLA in his drug-resistant epilepsy population. And he started to get some pretty good results, actually. Again, nothing in biology works for everybody, but it seemed like there were a very significant percentage of his epilepsy subjects were experiencing significant reductions in seizure frequency. So what that led to was actually, I think around, I want to say 2012, the Milken Foundation gave Krista Giorgio and his colleagues a grant to do a blinded study. They did, I think it was 50 subjects. They did 50 subjects at UCLA and USC in drug-resistant epilepsy, and they ran this double-blind trial. And the results were pretty good. There were some issues with the data population. It wasn't as clean as we would have hoped, but in my opinion, there definitely was a signal. And in fact, NeuroSIgma was originally founded to commercialize our technology in the drug-resistant epilepsy population. Due to the vagaries of startup life, capital formation, that sort of stuff, we did pivot. And essentially what happened was people were coming in, and some of them were having reductions in seizures, some of them were not. But it seemed independent of that effect. People were saying things like, doctor, I think my mood is improving. I'm thinking a little bit more clearly. I'm sleeping better is something that we've heard. And I just seem to be a little bit more pleasant to be around, more interactive, maybe in somebody who's disabled. So that clinical observation was taken to the UCLA Department of Psychiatry, primarily to a doctor named Ian Cook, who is actually NeuroSIgma's chief medical officer now. And Dr. Cook, spoke with some of his colleagues, in particular, this one guy named Dr. Jim McGuff, who is a pediatric psychiatrist. And truth be told, Dr. McGuff was initially very skeptical of this device, but we said, hey, we think based on clinical reports, this may actually help people with ADHD. Is it something you'd be interested in taking a look at? So we funded an open label trial there, and that was 24 subjects for an 8-week study. And in a pediatric population ages, I think 7 to 12, it might have been 8 to 12, that study. And the results were very good. And what I like about what Dr. McGuff, Jim, did is he set it up basically exactly like he would do for a new drug study, right? He used the same primary endpoint, same patient population, same duration of therapy. And using all of those very traditional metrics, we achieved a very clean, statistically significant effect. And so then what was done is Jim and his team leveraged that data set to get NIH funding for a blinded study of this time 62 subjects and a 4-week trial, because if you look at the open label data, it shows that the vast majority of the effect had occurred by 4 weeks. The 8-week time point was unnecessary. And we ran that study. It started in 2015. The data from the double blind reported out in 2018. And again, it was very clean, statistically significant at a high level. We achieved a P of 0.005 on the primary endpoint, so 10 times higher than the standard. And it was just, for reference sake, that's the ADHD RS4 scale. It's commonly used in this field. And so that data set was then used to file a de novo 510K with the FDA, which was ultimately approved. And in 2019, as I said, we became the first ever non-pharmaceutical to receive an FDA indication statement for treating ADHD. And more specifically, I should say our indication is for pediatric ADHD, ages 7 to 12. So that's how we got here. And right now we're trying to ramp this thing up, basically.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And again, I share the, not skepticism, but whoa, I can't believe this works. And it's sounding almost like it's more effective than a vagus nerve stimulator. You said you got about 40%, I don't know, efficacy with that. What's a typical percent for this?
Yeah, it's tough to compare yourself when you're dealing with trials of significantly different size and things like that. But so we've now run 2 blinded studies in the epilepsy indication, and neither of them huge. One of them had 50 subjects, one of them had 40. And in the 40 subject trial, which was subsequent to the one that Dr. DiGiorgio ran, it was frankly a better design study because we really zeroed in on the right patient population in terms of their seizure frequency, duration of treatment, endpoints, things like that. And we were able to achieve a 50% response rate after 6 months of eTNS. So half the people were able to reduce their seizures by 50% or more from baseline. That's how you define a responder in epilepsy. And that's actually quite a good result. If you look at either the vagus nerve data or the data from almost any pharmaceutical treating the drug-resistant epilepsy space, 40% is very competitive, if not better than most of those products get. So we feel pretty good about that. I'm losing my train of thought of what the question was.
No, I think that's really interesting. Okay, so you said this was the first non-pharmaceutical for ADHD. What are some typical side effects of pharmaceutical ADHD treatments, and what are some typical side effects of your guys' treatments?
Okay, so I'm happy to talk about that. I remembered what you're asking me is the difference between this and VNS. If I could quickly circle back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not as focused on VNS as I used to be when we were first starting this venture because now I'm more focused on the ADHD thing. But the difference between us and vagus nerve stimulation is that VNS is a unilateral low frequency nerve stimulation technology. They are limited to stimulating the left vagus nerve at frequencies of 30 hertz or less. And this is because there's a cardiac risk to stimulating the vagus nerve because it innervates the heart and affects the heart's conduction system. So it's unilateral low frequency. In contrast, our technology, TNS, is a bilateral high frequency technology. So we're stimulating, as I said, the V1 division of the trigeminal, but we're stimulating it on both sides of the forehead, and we're stimulating it at 120 hertz. And if you look at our data, the industry standard animal model for testing new anti-epilepsy therapeutics is the pentylene tetrazole seizure model in rats. And they test pretty much everything that comes in this. And what's interesting about that model is it's actually very good at predicting if a therapy has an anti-seizure effect What it is not good at is elucidating any possible safety problems with a new molecule or something like that. But anyway, so our data in this model very clearly shows that when TNS is delivered bilaterally and at frequencies in excess of 100 hertz, there is a very significant improvement in that anti-seizure effect. So that is why we think we may have some advantages to VNS in the seizure indication. But I know I'm going on here, but there's also another way to think about it, right? So as you said at the beginning, this is a wearable technology. It's a non-invasive device that people put it on their forehead at night and while they're asleep. But one of the things that we have worked on as a company, we went so far as to do animal studies of a prototype, is an implantable version of this device. And why I think there are some significant advantages, interesting things about that embodiment is that number one, it's a very minimally invasive system, right? You're not entering anybody's brain, you're not entering their neck to go into the vagus nerve. It is literally a subcutaneous sort of ribbon that is placed under the skin of the forehead. So it's very non-invasive. But more importantly, is you could, in a way, you could almost argue that product has the potential to have a 100% responder rate. So what I mean is you would first use the non-invasive system to identify who those responders are and then do the implant knowing that it is going to work ahead of time. So we think that's actually a very compelling business model, but not something that the company is currently focused on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think they do that with the spinal cord stimulators is they insert a trial lead, subcutaneous, percutaneous one, and then see if it would work. And then that's that after that they implant it. So this sounds like it'd be along the same lines.
Exactly.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so let's talk about the side effects of pharmaceutical ADHD treatment versus your guys' ones.
Yeah, so back to the commercial story. Yes. So ADHD medications. ADHD is actually a shockingly large market in the United States in particular and globally as well. I read a stat the other day, for example, that there are over 40 million prescriptions for Adderall in the United States on an annual basis. Okay. That's over 100,000 a day. Okay. So it's unbelievable how much Adderall is being prescribed in this country right now. And so why is that problematic? So look, over 80%, maybe even as high as 90% of the ADHD market is stimulants. And basically you have two categories of stimulants. You have the amphetamine derivatives. These are drugs like Adderall, Vyvanse, Dexedrine, things like that. And then you also have the methylphenidates. These are your Ritalins of the world. And all of them are these Schedule II, tightly controlled DEA style medications. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that they are very prone to abuse, addiction, and significant side effects. And now I don't think the world that I play in right now is pediatric ADHD. And I don't think that just because you put your 7 or 8 year old on Adderall that you're banishing them to a lifetime of stimulant addiction. I think that that's overly dramatic. And I know that these medications can be very helpful for people and have put a lot of kids on a better trajectory than they would have been otherwise. But I also think there are problems with these medications. So one of the most common things is the appetite suppression. So it's known that when you put your child on these medications, there's a very good chance, particularly in the boys, that they will stop eating as much. They will stop gaining weight at the rate that their peers do. There are some fears that they may not gain as much height as their peers. So I think that is very concerning to a parent of young children. Another thing that I hear about a lot is the personality changes. And that comes in two varieties. It's the personality changes when they go on the medication, when the stimulant achieves its effect. People often talk about like a flattening of the affect, less of a sense of humor, more serious, just not the same kid that they were before they were on their drug. But then what might is maybe even a little more common is in the evening when they come off their drugs, they tend to get cranky, right? Because coming down from an amphetamine. So that's not, people don't like that. So you get these behavioral problems at night, you get sleep disturbances. And then if you look at the FDA labels, there are some more significant things too, like cardiac rhythm abnormalities, sudden death, the abuse, the addiction, the college kids using it the night before the final, all that sort of stuff. To us, it seems very clear that there is a significant unmet need for a low side effect non-pharmaceutical, non-stimulant ADHD treatment alternative. And if I can cut that even a little finer, you know, I think it's, look, my background is in medicine, but I was not a psychiatrist. And frankly, I didn't know that much about ADHD when I got into this. But I think when you're on the outside looking in, you can dismiss ADHD pretty easily. You can say, oh, again, college kids taking Adderall, or they just need to suck it up or whatever. But you got to step back and think about that for a minute. Nobody is taking their kid, their 7-year-old, to a child psychiatrist because they want to put them on Adderall, right? No parent is doing that in the United States. The reason that they're doing it is because their kid has a problem. They're at the doctor because for whatever reason, their kid has some kind of problem that is preventing them from thriving in the normal school social environment that a 7 or 8-year-old is supposed to be in, whether it's they're not making friends, they're not doing their homework, they can't sit still, they're very argumentative and difficult to deal with. My point is that there are a huge number of families out there that are dealing with these issues. And I believe very strongly that many of them are averse to these stimulant medications, and that what we have is a significant solution to their problem.
Yeah, definitely. I think that in 50 years or something like this, we'll look at it as barbaric, essentially giving these drugs that are illegal, as you said, Schedule 2, and or like legal under very specific circumstances, and giving them to children that are developing, and God knows what was happening with their minds too. Okay, so that's that side. How bad does it get for your guys' stuff? What's the extent of the side effects? And then how do you get rid of the side effects? How long do the side effects linger?
Sure, that's a great question. And clearly I am biased, but I can look you in the eye and I can say, I think we have an extremely benign side effect profile, as frankly, most neurostimulation therapies do. As a class, really not a lot of side effects from these types of things, though they do exist. But to get to the point, so look, it's a wearable, as you said, and it's something that people put on their forehead. They wear it at night while they're sleeping. It's like a big band-aid, basically. So I would say our most common side effect is skin irritation at the site of the wearable that goes on their forehead. And that can range anywhere from extremely mild to fairly significant. But what I would say is, at least in our clinical trials, we've had extremely high compliance rates. And if someone is really motivated to get the therapy, it's it's very rare that it's treatment limiting that degree of skin irritation. Generally, what they would do is they'd stop for a few days, use an over-the-counter steroid cream, something like that. But it does happen. The other side effect that we do gets reported frequently is a headache. Because so remember this thing, you're putting it on your forehead, stimulating the trigeminal nerve, and you can feel it because the trigeminal nerve is a sensory nerve. And so our device, you connect the patch to the handheld neurostimulation unit, and the only parameter that the patients can actually control is the amplitude, right? So they're dialing up this amplitude. And I think it's just human nature that some people feel like if some is good, then more is better. And so I find usually in the people who report a headache, I think it's because they're turning it up too high. And if they simply turn it down a little bit, a lot of that can be mitigated. Now, maybe not every time with every patient, but a lot of the times I think it can. And when I'm talking to families about this, my mantra is perceptible, but not painful. So whatever the lowest sort of setting is where you can feel that tingling, that is what I recommend they keep it at.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark difference. Growth, disabilities, learning development, impairment, everything like this, and then tingling of the skin is the other side. That's a huge difference. And yeah, it's quite a stark contrast, I would say. I was kind of looking at
to be fair, I got to protect myself a little bit here. Now, if you look at our FDA label and the filings and the papers, there were other side effects reported, but they were at very low percentages. And there didn't tend to be a significant difference between the treatment and the placebo groups. So don't take it to the bank. You got to look at the data, but those are the two big ones that we see.
Yeah. No, that's still that's a huge, I would say that's a huge difference. And honestly, like I said, something that we'll be looking at as barbaric later on to something that's much more, like you said, like a band-aid or something like this. It is an interesting setup though, because it is a wired system, so it's almost like headphones or something like this, and you're using it as you sleep. So I was wondering if there's a choking issue or anything like this, and how does that work?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And other people have expressed similar concerns. So, what I can say is basically we provide some tools for cord management with the device so that you don't have this huge floppy cord laying around. And I find that patients tend to adapt to it themselves and figure out a way to keep it out of their sleeping area so they're comfortable at night. And we've never had an issue. We've used this device in well over 1,000 people, clinical trials commercially now, and that has never been reported, but certainly it's something that we need to be very vigilant about being aware of. The other thing I would say is that later this year, or excuse me, I'm thinking it's already 2023, in mid 2023, we hope to be releasing the next generation version of our product. Now, that device is going to be basically smaller, more modern. It'll have some interesting capabilities we can talk about, but it's very similar to what we have already, and it's still a wired system. But one of the things that we do intend to do for the V3 system is more of a wireless headband sort of device that gets rid of any sort of tether.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So I recently got one of the Aura rings that tracks your sleeping and everything like this, and I really like it. I've really enjoyed wearing it. It shows when you're in deep sleep, REM, all this kind of stuff. I'm wondering how, if you have this kind of tingling sensation, how does that affect your sleep? Is there any reports, or were you guys able to cross-reference it with any other kind of sleep metrics to see if the quality of sleep might be diminished or maybe even increased?
That is a great question. And like I said, this isn't something that I had thought of myself. It's not my intellectual baby. It's something I've been involved with for a while. But I say that because I think sometimes when things aren't your baby, it's a little easier to look at them objectively. And when I was first involved with this stuff, that was really my biggest concern, to be totally honest with you. Like, really, people are going to wear this thing at night, and is this thing going to get all tied up, and do you think they're going to do it? I was very skeptical. But what I can tell you is that one of the most common things that I hear, and a way that I know a patient is responding, is that they tell me their sleep is improving. That is very common. And I can talk about why I think that is. Basically, you're a neuroscientist. Do you remember the mammalian diving reflex? Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, yeah.
So basically, I think all mammals, when you put your face in water, what happens is your heart rate goes down and the arteries to your peripheral system constrict, while the arteries to your central organs and your brain, they dilate. And that's obviously an oxygen preservation adaptation. And so that is a reflex that is mediated by the trigeminal nerve talking to the vagus nerve in the brainstem. And so, my very strong belief, which I do have some preliminary data to support, is that one of the ways this device works is by increasing parasympathetic nervous system activity. And so, that I believe is why people report calming effect and an improved sleep effect, because they're seeing that fight or flight and increasing the rest and digest.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe refocusing more blood to the brain. And yeah, that's very interesting. That, which is weird because like a tingling, I would almost think that's like annoying or something that would cause stress or something like this, but I guess maybe you get used to it. Yeah, this
You
is
do.
yeah.
Actually, so if you don't turn it up too high, as I said, and you wear it for an hour, many people don't even feel it after the hour. Your nerve kind of attenuates to the stimulation.
Okay. Yeah, this is very cool. Okay, you said it takes 4 weeks to usually see results, and then there's a certain percentage of people that do this. So, how can you tell? Would people come in to the doctor and instead of doing the Ritalin first, they would try this, and then only if it didn't work, they'd move to that? Or what's a protocol? Or so you guys are FDA approved, so ostensibly you already have the plans, right?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, and it gets to the marketing strategy, frankly, which is not something that I'm necessarily an expert in, but I'm learning more and more as we do this. When I first got into this, I thought exactly what the first thing you said was, oh, this is obvious. This is going to be a first-line therapy for people who don't want to take medication. And I should say, too, our label is as monotherapy because that's how we ran our clinical trials. And so that seemed very obvious to me. But as I've spoken more to the physicians in the field and become more familiar with this field, I actually think it might be the opposite in the sense that a lot of these new therapies tend to start out with the train wrecks, as they call them, the people for which nothing else has worked or have tried, are on something but still having problems and things like that. It's interesting. One of the things with the ADHD market is that if you talk to a teenager who's had ADHD their entire life, you'll find that they've pretty much been on all of the medications at one time or another. And that's because a lot of times they'll take their meds while they're in school, and then maybe it's summer break and they don't love taking the meds, so they go off for summer break, but then they go back to school and they come on, and invariably they'll try something different because they didn't like this about the last thing, whatever. So it's very common in this field for people to cycle through all of these different medications. And really, it wouldn't surprise me if we just end up being part of that cycling treatment algorithm. And of course, we want to retain our patients for as long as possible. But again, just given sort of the size of the market, the number of individuals we're actually talking about here, millions, even if we can just insert ourselves into that cycling algorithm, this will be a very successful product.
And then I think at that point, you'd get more word of mouth and people would use you earlier and earlier. And then, yeah, you guys are for adolescent ADHD. Could adults use this, or is this something that you guys are looking into getting into? Adults have ADHD as well, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So actually, so our label right now is 7 to 12 years old. But about 2 months ago, we're working with a group at King's College in London who received a pretty large grant, about $2.6 million from the British government, to do a trial of our device in adolescents and also as adjunctive therapy. So they're doing 150 subjects, double blind, randomized in kids, adolescents, and people who are on drugs at the same time. And they're also supplementing that with fMRI in about a third of the subjects. We think we're just going to learn a ton when that trial is over. And actually, so anecdote for you, I was in London last week at a conference and doing some other stuff, and I stopped by King's College to just see how things are going. And they have a waiting list of 110 people. They just started the trial 2 months ago. Okay. They've already completed 8 subjects. They got 110 people on a waiting list. And they told me they're doing a drug trial simultaneously, and they've been doing it for over a year, and they've only been able to get 9 people to enter it because no one wants to put their kids on the drugs. And it's hard to convey like how excited they were about it. Like they were so just enthusiastic because this was never had this much response for a clinical trial before. And sometimes if you've ever been a part of startup life, sometimes you wonder, heck, are you doing this stuff for? But then when you go and meet with the folks at King's and they tell you how enthusiastic, you're like, okay, this makes sense. That's good. So that was a nice little surprise.
That is exciting. It's paradigm changing, and it really is like a completely different thing. Okay, so you said that college students use Ritalin, Adderall, everything like this. Is this something that college students wanting to study more are going to be sneaking in their kids' subscription or the little sister's subscription of NeuroSIgma? What does this look like?
I guess it's possible. So does adult ADHD exist? Of course, yeah. These kids grow up. Some people do grow out of their ADHD, but some people have this problem into adulthood. And we have had some limited clinical experience with physicians in Europe using it for adult ADHD, and they've reported some good results. As a small company, you do just have to focus and go where the resources are. And we also just think there's just a very clear value proposition in the kids. You don't want to put your 7-year-old on Adderall, so maybe give this a try. So that's why we focus there. But absolutely, we believe it works in adults, but it's not clear how we're going to prove that in the near to medium term at the moment.
Okay. And then, yeah, you mentioned you're a small company and growing, got to focus on things and funding and everything like this. This is spun out of UCLA. So I guess what does your funding look like? Has UCLA supported you with this, or have you gone the VC route, investments or grants, or are you being paid, or are they paying you in magic beans?
Yeah, no magic beans. I have two kids, so I do need actual cash going into my pocket. But so look, we're a bit of a weird company in terms of how we've been funded to date. So it's mostly been high net worth individuals combined with government grants. So the chairman of our company was a guy named Lod Cook, and Lod was a pretty successful businessman here in LA for many years. He was actually the CEO of Arco Oil, which I'm sure you've seen Arco stations. It was the fifth largest oil company in the world at the time that he was running it. And then he went on to do some other things, but essentially, him and some of his contacts in the oil and gas industry and just other high net worth individuals he knows or knew have provided the bulk of our funding. We've also had something on the order of, I think at this point, about $5 million in NIH grants, the non-dilutive funding that we used. That was a lot of that was to develop the prototype of the implantable system, but also to develop parts of the external system as well. But yeah, as you say, we are now focused on commercialization and growth, and that really becomes more of an institutional investor type story. It's not easy to find high net worth individuals capable of supporting a true medical device commercialization. So we have pivoted and are looking and have been successful, I should say. At the beginning of this year, we did close a $5 million investment from KT. KT is Korea Telecom. It's the largest sort of telecommunications company in Korea. Think of it as the AT&T of Korea, basically. And you might say, that's a little bit of a weird one there, Colin. How did that happen? So KT has identified digital health as a platform for future growth of their company. And they view NeuroSIgma as a key component of that strategy, because if you think about it, I actually think it's pretty cool, our potential in digital health, because you've got these companies like Pear Therapeutics, Achille, things like that, where it's purely an electronic offering, right? It's basically an app or a game or something like that that patients have to interact with, and that's fine. I'm not knocking what anybody does, but I think what's really cool and unique about what we do is we have this sort of handheld electronic therapeutic device, right? We have an actual therapy, but I mentioned our next generation platform that's coming out in June. That's going to have a Bluetooth in it. Right? So basically, we're going to have this like sort of consumer electronics type device that people are interacting with on a daily basis. They're going to be able to control it via their smartphone. And then I think what you can do is you can start layering on top some very interesting things. Most basic iteration of that would just be device functionality. How many hours did you use it last week? Go one step up. Maybe you're giving people surveys about the progression of their illness. Is this helping? Yes or no? Do you want to send this data back to your doctor? You can do things like remind them it's time to refill their prescription, maybe gamify it for the kids a little bit. Oh, you got a gold star because you did 5 days in a row, stuff like that. But then I think maybe the biggest sort of aspect of that digital health platform is if you just typed in right now into Google, like ADHD app, there's a few of them out there. They offer cognitive behavioral therapy based solutions in an app format to help people control their ADHD. There's no reason that NeuroSIgma couldn't do that too, right? So I look at the app almost as like a customer acquisition funnel, right? Like we could have something on iTunes, you search for an ADHD app, and yeah, we'll offer that cognitive behavioral therapy solution. But also, by the way, did you know there's this prescription device that works with this app and things like that? So I think that's where things get a little interesting. And I know I'm going on, but I wanted to go back to the cognitive thing real quick. In both our blinded and the open label trials for ADHD, the kids got cognitive tests both at baseline and after either 4 or 8 weeks of therapy. And there were absolutely some very statistically significant improvements on certain metrics, most notably things like working memory, cognitive tempo, certain aspects of reaction time. And so we think that's very interesting. So we actually have another trial going on at UCLA where one of the things they're doing is seeing if they can take a baseline cognitive profile to predict who's going to respond to the therapy, which would be fantastic because psychiatry is still largely a field of clinical diagnosis, right? There's not a lot of objective lab tests you can run to see if somebody has bipolar disorder. So we think that could be very exciting if we're one of the first sort of, I don't know, quantitative approaches to a psychiatric diagnosis. That would be great. But I think there's also implications for that cognitive data in a larger sense. Cognitive enhancement, you're doing your homework, you mentioned that earlier, but maybe Alzheimer's disease. Maybe we could take people with mild cognitive impairment and slow their disease progression. So that's something company has thought about and is looking at as well.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting stuff. It seems the sky's the limit, and there's a lot of things that this can treat, and it can help a lot of people. How would you prevent? I bought a TENS unit, transcutaneous neurostimulator online. It was $15 or something like this for abs or legs or whatever. I hated it. I didn't like it. But how would you prevent these kind of Chinese knockoffs just doing whatever sticker and copying you guys? And maybe it's not by the doctor, but people look on forums and stuff like this, and you can get almost the same thing with this. How would you guys prevent against that?
Yeah, I think there's a few answers there. And again, back to it not being my baby, that has been a concern of mine for a long time too. And I think it partly depends upon the market that you're talking about. So in the United States, I can see some very clear, and Europe, but very clear barriers to entry. The first, obviously, being the intellectual property portfolio. So we have an exclusive worldwide license to all of UCLA's patents on this, and then we've supplemented them with our own internal patents as we've developed the therapy over the years. So we have a pretty large IP portfolio at this point, which I believe will provide us with protection from copycats in regulated markets, right? The second barrier is the regulatory barrier. In the United States, if you're going to make, in Europe, if you're going to make healthcare related indication statements, then you have to get through that FDA process, right? That will provide a barrier in of itself. They'll have to meet certain standards. They'll have to spend the time and money to make the device. And then at the end of the road, you're still competing with a device that's got some very robust patent protection too. So that's number two. And then thirdly is I think it has something to do with the insurance market here, right? One of the questions that we have struggled with this product is does it make more sense as consumer electronics type pricing, or is it more traditional insurance reimbursement, like a medical device or pharmaceutical business model? And my strong feeling at the moment is that we should pursue the more traditional pharmaceutical medical device reimbursement. And I think that is good for a number of reasons, because one of the things that I like about what NeuroSIgma has done is I think we've really tried very hard to develop a high quality scientific, clinical, and even basic science data set. I think some of these non-invasive neurostimulation companies out there really don't have a lot of the data and the basic science to back up the claims they make in the way that we do. And so I want to align myself with that more traditional system, prescription-based product where a doctor's monitoring it. And once I think these larger trials, the King's College one, the UCLA one that I mentioned out, once those report data in 2024, I think we are going to be in a very good position to get extremely favorable reimbursement throughout the United States, national health systems in Europe, Japan, Korea. And what that's going to do for us is it's really, what would be the point of me trying to get a $15 TENS unit on Amazon and looking on forums and yada, yada, if I know I can get a doctor prescribed, FDA approved product for a very reasonable copay from my insurance company.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. It's much less risky. I was in this forums world a little bit a few years ago. That's probably why I'm thinking about it a little bit more. But Colin, this has been really interesting. I've really enjoyed this. This is very promising technology. I hope it takes off the way we both do. We both hope it does. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, thanks. I know I just went stream of consciousness on you there sometimes. So thanks for listening. But it's been a pleasure. It's good to get the the message out.
Yeah, hopefully this will be much more common in the coming years. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.